we're very pleased to have Libby here to talk about the positive impact and net benefit, new ways to communicate value and speed up investments in scalable, sustainable plastic solutions. Please join me in welcoming Libby Bernick.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. And it's great to be in Dallas. I've been here all week and happy to be ending my week at Plasticity. So I'm concerned about the problem associated with the way that businesses and society are managing plastic materials and how these problems have what I call very long environmental tails. And I'm sure that each of you are also concerned too, because you're here at this conference. And it's a huge problem, worth considering in a much more urgent way and with a larger group of stakeholders. Plastic makers and the manufacturers should not be solely responsible for these very problematic waste management practices in the about 5 countries that put 80% of this plastic material in the water. But these plastic products are so cheap, so durable, and disposable that they're accumulating at a tremendous pace in our waterways. And it needs the support of industry to participate in these discussions, and I'm glad to see many of you here. And it's the solutions that we need to save us all from having more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050, which is what some researchers are suggesting will happen. So the problem, as I see it, is growing very rapidly as we have this cheap packaging that has made single-serve consumer products a preference in populations that can only afford a small quantity at a time. And globally, many communities are now adopting our model in the US, where society prizes consumption and disposal, and the advantage of plastic over glass is tremendous. And while these plastic materials are much better for food safety, preservation, or even resistance to decay, these are the same characteristics that make this long tail problem for our environment when they're not managed properly at the end of life. So I'm going to share with you today some of our perspectives on the challenges and barriers to more sustainable plastic use, and how, in our point of view, we need to start taking into account the value of what we make and what we throw away, in particular around plastics. And also share a few examples of companies that are demonstrating leadership and showing us the way on how to measure and value these kinds of systems. So let me first provide a little bit of context about Trucost, which is, sorry. Is this the slide advance?
Yeah, that's the green one. The green one.
There we go. Thank you. So let me provide a little bit of context about Trucost, which is an ESG, environmental, social, and governance data and analytics company that is now part of S&P Dow Jones indices. S&P is the largest ratings company in the world, working with about 10,000 corporations globally. And many of you are probably also familiar with our indices, the S&P 500 probably being one of the best known. But in this crowd, you might also be familiar with the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. This month, I'm excited to tell you that S&P Ratings will be launching a green evaluation tool for bonds, and will also assess the environmental performance of new green technologies, perhaps some of yours, that are being financed. So within Trucost, we straddle that space between corporations and investors, providing data and insights on ESG risks and opportunities so that market participants can make better informed decisions about investments. So over the last 15 years, Trucost has amassed very large databases and built very detailed, sophisticated models that is able to quantify environmental performance. And we're able to look at business value at risk in an investment portfolio or within a supply chain or across a series of commodities. So what's really important from our point of view is understanding environmental and social performance, the actual human, environmental, and social capital, and then connecting the dots between environmental performance, social performance, to financial performance. So our aim in doing all of this is really to speed up the flow of capital towards more sustainable business models. So the problem, and you heard Bob Grace describe some of the challenges with our linear economy and the need to transition to one that's more circular, where we've got these valuable materials that are reused rather than disposed. So about 4 years ago, through Doug Woodring's leadership, the United Nations Environmental Program and Ocean Recovery Alliance engaged Trucost to understand the environmental costs of plastic use in production and consumer products. So for plastics, these environmental costs are about $75 billion globally per year. These are environmental costs like air emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, land and water pollution, and the like, associated with making, transporting, and then disposing of plastics from consumer products and packaging. Now, this is a significant risk to the industry and clearly unsustainable when you think about a $75 billion cost in relation to the $750 billion value of the industry. So when you think about these environmental costs being realized as a financial cost for the industry through carbon tax, reduced water allocations in water-scarce regions where production might occur, or even increased requirements for pollution control systems, clearly we've got an unsustainable business model. So what happened as a result of this study is that people started saying, well, maybe we should switch from using plastic to other materials. Maybe that would reduce the environmental costs, and maybe it would especially reduce the environmental costs to the oceans. So about 1.5 years ago, the American Chemistry Council decided to take this on and look at both the costs and the benefits of plastic and look at the costs of alternative materials and whether indeed switching to alternative materials would reduce the cost. And what we found is that the alternatives aren't better. In fact, on average, the environmental costs of these alternative packaging materials and products are about 4 times higher than they are for plastic materials. And when we look at the situation with ocean and ocean impacts, these costs are about 2.5 times higher with alternative materials. And we also flagged that many of these ocean impacts are coming from mismanaged waste in Asia. So one way to think about this is that we're kind of stuck with the problem that we have. We can't just switch our way out of using plastics to something else in the hopes that it's going to fix the problem. And we've also got a waste management problem related to plastics. So it's a different way of thinking about things, perhaps, than what had been done before. There's also been some great work in the last year or two looking at the leaks and flows of plastic within the global economy. And it's probably not a surprise to those of you in the room, but what we know is that there's a lot of ways that plastic is leaking out of the system and not being captured. For example, out of the 12 million tons of plastic that go into the ocean every year, about 9 million tons of that are coming from the land. So think about it. We've invested enormous amounts of money to extract carbon molecules, petroleum, out of the ground. We make that carbon into plastic. We package a consumer product, we toss away the paper, and then it goes back into the deep, deep ocean. Does that make sense? What an enormous amount of lost value of a key commodity material, and it shows us where we can start to plug the leaks in this system. So why aren't we plugging the leaks in the system? Why aren't we tackling this challenge? Well, one reason is that reducing these $75 billion in environmental costs of plastic use is really hard, because we're talking about changing public beliefs, and we're also talking about harnessing collective action, two things that are never easy to do. If any of you have been involved in any organizational change projects within your own company, you know how hard it can be to change the collective will. So think about this too. We've been teaching people how to recycle for over 30 years, blue bins, separate waste streams, but progress is just too slow. Globally, we're at about 14% of plastic being recycled. And if you look at this slide, you can see all of the different organizations and individuals and roles that are required to make change. So within the industry itself, the way we make plastic needs to change. You've got organizations like Steve Davies working to use bio-based materials. You've got product designers like Andrea here from Dell who are looking at different ways to make computers that involve green design and circular economy principles. But then we have other organizations like the entire waste management industry, whether it involves municipalities or for-profit companies. And then, of course, we have to educate the public about capturing litter and preventing it from going into our waterways. So why is this hard? Well, a couple reasons. We have a lot of different organizations involved, but I think the problem is also very abstract, and we're also not talking about this in terms of value of the environmental resource and value of the commodity required to make these consumer goods. So what do I mean by this notion of abstract? Well, think about it. When you throw something away, where exactly is this place called away? For most of us in the US, it's probably the trash bin, but elsewhere, because of leaks in that system that I showed you, away is out of sight, out of mind, and probably, ultimately, the ocean or a beach that is somewhere far away, out of sight, out of mind. So the other barrier that I really want to focus on is that we're not assigning the right value to what is required to make, transport, and dispose of plastic. So we need to account for costs and values that are not currently being considered. And on this slide, what I'm showing you is the general approach that Trucost uses to value the positive impact of a new technology or a new product. So in essence, what we're doing is understanding from the full value chain perspective all of the environmental costs, whether they're related to greenhouse gas emissions or waste or air pollution or pollution to the land, adding up all of those impacts to our communities, assigning a monetary value to those environmental costs, the environmental costs being those costs realized by society, and then transforming that into a positive impact in monetary terms. So why do we do this? Well, from a technical standpoint, it makes the math easy. It makes us able to add up all of those impacts using one common unit. But from a perspective of business, there's equally important reasons. When we do this, when we communicate positive benefits of products in monetary terms, we're speaking the language of business. We can communicate with peers in finance, marketing, and HR in terms that they understand. And it allows companies to consider environmental costs right alongside the financial costs that would be in a pro forma, for example, that you might provide to your investor. I also think, though, that communicating the true cost of products also helps engage communities and your customers. So for many people, nature's probably a little abstract. It might be a place where they go for a Sunday afternoon stroll. But seeing the true cost of consumer products shows these consumers that these environmental impacts are real. They're not taking place on some beach in some faraway location. They're being paid for by society, and they're actually a drag on our economy. So from Trucost's point of view, valuing the true cost of commodity materials like plastic can be the catalyst that shifts us from awareness about this problem to real action and driving investment in a better materials recovery system and towards a circular economy. Think about it. A risk-adjusted commodity price is what would capture the attention of a procurement manager. Avoided risk in monetary terms is what would capture the attention of your customer or an investor, and probably provides the extra nudge that's often needed to make the business case on one of these solutions. So by bringing together all the different entities and organizations involved in the system, whether it's businesses, investors, communities, environmental organizations, to assess scientific models and using environmental costs, we find that it gives people common ground to set priorities. We've used this approach to weigh environmental costs and financial costs of different options. It's a great way to bypass some of the hyperbole and subjectivity that can sometimes stall a conversation when you get diverse groups of people sitting in a room who have competing interests. So by putting a monetary value on the alternatives, we often find it's a great conversation starter and a way to progress a very hard and often difficult conversation. So let me give you a few examples of how this is actually being done. The first one I'll share with you is with a company called Jaques. They make a bio-based plastic, which is used in a variety of end products, including footwear. And we worked with Jaques to understand the avoided environmental cost on a unit basis of their plastic. But what was really interesting about the approach that they took was that they said, what would happen if this material was adopted at scale? What is the avoided societal cost when the addressable market takes up this new material? So this is a pretty exciting example of how these kinds of metrics can be used to change the conversation and look at opportunities on a very widespread scale. It's also a great example of how changing the production method and using an alternative raw material can be part of the solution. It's one of those boxes that I showed you on that diagram illustrating all of the key players that are involved. The other example I want to show you is from a very large retailer in Latin America, where we've worked with them for a number of years to understand the environmental cost in their operations and supply chain. And for this retailer, whose beverages form a significant part of their business model, as you would suspect, water was high on their priority. And they were thinking, well, in order to create our beverage and make our beverage and bottle it and sell it, we need a lot of water. And there's a lot of water-scarce regions within Latin America that help them understand their priorities. But this past year, working with them, they said, we want to take a bigger picture view of our entire enterprise and start looking at the waste that's generated from the plastic bottles and the disposables that we sell. And so historically, we'd always focus just on their upstream supply chain and their direct operations. And you can see those two bars there to the left, the one for supply chain and direct operations. And when we applied this valuation lens this year to look at the entire value chain, we found that actually the waste impacts the environmental costs from disposing of all the packaging materials dwarfed the supply chain and direct operation environmental costs by almost an order of magnitude. You can see that there's a little slice in the bar. We couldn't even fit it on the graph. So what this technique showed is that it provided a different lens to look at a company's operation and the impacts that they create, and certainly illustrated to us the importance not just of reducing impacts through operations, but in managing the waste that is created from plastic materials. We also have worked with Dell for a number of years, and Andrea is going to talk about some of the projects that they've taken on to look at more sustainable materials. So I don't want to take any thunder away from her, except to mention that we do acknowledge their leadership in assessing the net benefit of their systems and really applaud what they have done. So the final point I want to make takes us back to some of the work that we did with the American Chemistry Council. And what we found looking at the system as a whole is that there's a number of things that can be done, and it's up to all of us and all of our collective actions to do it. So you might remember that looking at this system, there's many different ways within the value chain that we can reduce environmental costs and create positive impact. And these incremental efforts add up. So for example, if we look at consumer products globally, the packaging, the plastic that goes into them, and the plastic that goes into the packaging, if we look at applying low carbon energy to make the plastic and just increase fuel efficiency by 20% in transporting the plastic, make just a 20% reduction in packaging materials and a 10% increase in waste recovery, none of those things sound that onerous, do they? That adds up to $30 billion in avoided environmental costs for our communities. A circular economy is great because it reduces waste, but ultimately it's about reducing inputs, these environmental inputs to the economy. So I'll leave you with the message that this vision, the creating products in a way that's sustainable, that takes into account the financial cost and the environmental benefits and social ones in practical terms, takes all of us to make it real, away from the abstract and all of our collective actions. Thank you all very much.
Any question here? Was there one?
Thank you. I had a question about, I know we're talking about plastics, but when you applied this life cycle analysis to other materials, do you see plastics as having the most benefit, or do you think there are other materials that are going to be prioritized over as far as financially incentives and other greenhouse gas and environmental benefits?
Mm-hmm. Well, for the work that we did with the American Chemistry Council, our focus was rather narrow. We were simply trying to answer the question, would it make sense to switch away from plastic to other materials? Because, of course, of the concerns regarding the environmental costs with plastic. The industry wanted to work to lower these costs wherever they might be. So we looked at 7 different alternative materials within just consumer products sectors, I believe 17 different industry sectors. So we weren't looking across the entire global economy. We were focused on consumer products. But in general, what we found is that the environmental cost of alternative materials in consumer products was about 4 times higher than plastics. So again, driving home the need that those of us in the room, our focus is on plastics, and it needs to be, because just switching to other materials isn't going to help.
Has the evolving ton presented any challenges to your work as far as the lightweighting of packaging and the increased, I guess, the less value, it requires greater tonnage to recover the value of these lightweighting products?
So those are all part of the challenges. The speaker was asking about lightweighting of materials, and of course that has an environmental benefit when we look at the reduced environmental cost to transport things. So that's a good thing, but then the lightweighting of materials and the lightweighting of plastics makes it sometimes harder to capture the plastic in the waste stream. So it's that dual benefit and dual cost. So it is a challenge, not one easily reconciled.
Yeah, I think one of the points there is that it's very difficult for us to go back to glass and metal and all these other materials. We've gone as low as we can on the low-hanging fruit with the plastic, and now we've got it. So the challenge of why we're here today is how to fix that and then get that back and not have that waste impact, because there's not much more lightweighting we can do. There's not much chance we're going back to metal and glass on a lot of these materials. Any other quick question? Okay, thank you very much, Libby.
Thank you, Doug.